Here's a word that I bet you're sick of hearing: electability. Throughout the 2020 Democratic primary, we heard this word again and again. And in fact, I don't think I ever really heard it before this election cycle. Of course, this notion of electability is based on things like poll data, platform policy, in particular, the candidate's stance on those key issues like Medicare for all or student loan forgiveness, which have only become more relevant in light of recent events. Then there's their popularity with those all-important swing voters, people in states like Ohio and Florida who apparently haven't made up their mind who they're going to vote for in November and could swing the entire election. Now, these are all really important things, and that's what the pundits should be focusing on. But what I wanted to look at is the actual historical precedent for former vice presidents becoming president and senators. So what are the odds? I mean, what is the statistical advantage or disadvantage of being a former vice president compared to being a senator when you want to become a president? Initially, from the look of it, vice presidents have a pretty good track record. I mean, out of 45 presidents, 14 of them, almost 1/3, were first vice presidents. In fact, this guy, John Adams, was the very first vice president, and he became the second president. But when you look more closely out of these 14 people, 9 of them were actually not initially elected as president. 8 of them took over when the president died in office, and one of them, Gerald Ford, took over when the president resigned. In fact, Gerald Ford wasn't even elected to vice president. He was appointed to that as well when Spiro Agnew resigned a year earlier. Now, out of these 9 people, 3 of them never sought re-election, and a further 2 of them did seek re-election, but they lost on their first try. Well, there's 5 that we can take out right away. That leaves 4 former vice presidents who actually ran as incumbent presidents, and then 5 more who ran on their VP status alone. But it's not quite that cut and dried. For example, LBJ, Teddy Roosevelt, and George H.W. Bush all won one election and lost another one. Nixon won twice and lost once, and Martin Van Buren won once and lost twice. Then there's the case of Thomas Jefferson, who actually tied in the election of 1800, and it was so contested that Congress actually rewrote the entire rule book for how elections would be carried out from that time forward. Now let's have a look at the Senate. I mean, the Senate is sometimes called presidential preschool or a presidential incubator because of how many presidents got their start there. But having a look at this, it's not that much different from the vice president list that we saw before. Also, before we get started, I wanted to say a couple funny things. First of all, this guy, Franklin Pierce, his mom's name was Anna Kendrick. I'm not even kidding about that. And this guy, James Buchanan, for years he's been considered the worst president in history by almost everybody, until recently when somebody knocked him out of that place. Now, out of these 16 people, 6 of them actually were former VPs, and of those 6, 4 of them were not initially elected to the office. The remaining 2, Nixon and Van Buren, also lost at least one election. So perhaps being a senator is not exactly the best path to becoming president. After all, out of all of these people, only 3 people went directly from the Senate to the presidency. That's my man Barry in the corner, my man JFK in the other corner, and Warren Gamaliel Harding. So what is the best path to the presidency? Well, we've already looked at vice presidents, and we've looked at senators. Most people say that governors is the best path to the presidency, but only 17 of them began as governors. Compare that with 19 who started as U.S. representatives. 22 presidents began their career in the military, and 26 began as lawyers. This looks pretty good for Biden because he's not only a vice president, but he's also a senator and a lawyer. Compare that with Sanders, who has the distinction of serving both in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. It's pretty clear that just looking at the Senate's track record and the vice presidency's track record at creating presidents is not going to be enough. So let's have a look at the actual election data. Now here's a list of every presidential election that involved a former vice president. Right off the bat, that one at the top in 1796 with John Adams. This is before the invention of the modern two-party system, and candidates at that time didn't even really have to campaign like they do now. Also, the role of the president and the vice president were not really defined the same way they are now, and the way that they were elected is so different than the way that modern elections are conducted, it's better just to cross that one off. Also, that election of 1800 that was decided in a tie, well, it ultimately was decided by Congress because they had the same number of popular votes and electoral votes. Congress at that time was led by Alexander Hamilton, who famously despised Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr's the guy running against Jefferson here. For a lot of reasons, we should probably cross this one off as well. That leaves us with 21 elections, and I have made a special note here where the candidate ran as an incumbent president. This is important because incumbent presidents have something called the incumbency advantage. It means that they have better access to campaign finance. They have better name recognition, or as we might call it, branding. After all, in the case of an incumbent, you're really deciding whether or not the guy should keep his job, as opposed to if you should hire somebody new. Also, incumbents have other government resources up their sleeve. For example, congressmen don't have to use postage when they write to their constituents recommending a particular candidate. Now, having said all of this, although 98% of all senators tend to keep their seats, only 15 presidents have actually won a second term. 5 presidents didn't even get their own party's nomination. And 10 of them, while they did get the nomination, they went on to lose the election. So perhaps the word incumbency advantage is not the correct word here. But still, it does skew the data a bit, so we're going to consider this as a separate data set. Comparing this with the Senate. Now, right off the bat, those first 2 elections in 1792 and 1796, for reasons mentioned previously, should probably not be considered. Also, that tie in 1800, which was not legitimate for several reasons, we're going to cross that off as well. You're welcome, Aaron Burr. We might also want to cross off the election of 1820 just because James Monroe ran completely unopposed. There's also some other quirks here. For example, that election of 1824 with John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, they were actually both in the same party. So was everybody in that election. I've also made a special note here where people ran as a third-party candidate. Of note is the election of 1836, where William Henry Harrison ran against Martin Van Buren. Both of them were former senators, as were all 4 of the third-party candidates who ran against them. Also of note is that election of 1848, in which Martin Van Buren is running as a third party. This is Martin Van Buren who created the Democratic Party, and then, a few years later, ran on the Free Soil Party. I've also made a special note here where people ran as incumbent presidents. This leaves us with 29 total elections and 52 senators. Now, an important note here is I've only included senators who actually got their party's nomination and went all the way to the general election. The reason why I'm not including senators like Sanders, who ran only in the primary, is because I would very quickly get into the triple digits. I mean, consider the last election cycle by itself. We had Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio on one side, and Clinton and Sanders on the other side. In fact, just since the 70s, there have been 60 senatorial bids for president, most of them unsuccessful. So here's how the data is actually played out then. It looks like 60% of all vice presidential bids for president actually resulted in defeat. And of the 40% that actually led to victory, only 20% of those were by people who were not using the incumbency advantage. In other words, for somebody like Joe Biden, who is running on his VP status alone, 56% of VPs lost. Compare that with 44% who won. Now let's compare that to the Senate. 59% of all senators who ran for president lost. However, if we throw in some of those third-party candidates, it's actually closer to 67% that lost. But there's some other factors at work here. For example, party politics. Here's a look at the election results based on the party. Now, the first 4 columns here are all vice presidential bids. I separated them by incumbent and non-incumbent. If you look at all of the vice presidents who lost without the incumbency advantage, 80% of them were Democrats. Only 20% were Republican. Compare that with those who won, and about 25% were Democrats, and 75% were Republicans. Jumping over a few columns, if we look at the people who ran as senators, the first thing you might notice is there's a lot marked other. That's because any election before 1850 is before the modern two-party system. But besides that, you'll notice that a lot more Democrats won and a lot fewer Democrats lost. So what does this actually say about electability? Is Joe Biden actually electable? Well, here's some things to take away. 60% of former VPs tend to lose the election. 59% of major party senators also lose, so that's a wash. Is Joe Biden more electable than Donald Trump? Well, here's the thing. Donald Trump is a statistical anomaly. He's the only candidate in history to have no experience with elected office, appointed office, or any type of military experience whatsoever. So who's the more electable one here? Well, based on the criteria that we've been looking at, it's definitely Biden. But if there's one thing that we learned from the 2016 election cycle, it's that the American voting public is anything but predictable. These type of stats and studies really don't do anything to predict who's going to win. For president nerds like me, I can't wait to find out in November.